Appreciate the opportunity to be here after lunch. I keep, on occasion, people ask me to give this talk on reintroduction of fire to prescribe burn or to fire suppressed stands, and was happy to take this invitation. This time it was in between AARP meetings for me. Just kidding. I feel like I've been having this discussion for a while. In fact, if you look out on one of the tables is this brochure that the Longleaf Alliance has. It came from the Dead Sea, a set of scrolls along with it. Now, I think we produce this, the Longleaf Alliance and the Jones Center produced this, I want to say it was 15 or 16 years ago. It might be a little bit longer, but the message is still the same, generally the same. So, you know, each time I give this talk, I'm hoping that we convince more and more people about this issue of reintroduction of fire and some of these stands. So who's heard this discussion before? By show of hands in the audience. I know you have, Marty. Goodness, okay. Well, good, a fresh crowd. Oh, that's awesome. Yeah, Ken Parker got on my case last time I gave this talk in Tifton. He's like, John, you need to update your slides. And you know, Windows 95 was a really solid program, so I don't see why we need to do that. But yeah, I guess the point is this is a discussion we've been having for a while, and there's a constant need to have this discussion. It was originally focused around longleaf pine and some of the challenges that we've had with longleaf, but as we're expanding our reach into reintroducing fire, we're seeing it with a lot of the other southern pines as well. And so I wanted to bring that up, and that's why I was asked to come is you know, what do we know about reintroducing fire to other southern pines as well? So the take-home message is it's the same. You know, we can kill old trees with fire if we put it under the wrong conditions, and we just need to be mindful of those conditions. So with that introduction, you know, again, longleaf pine, normally when we're talking at these council meetings, it's about longleaf pine. I mean, we know it, we know the role of fire in longleaf pine. We spent the last 20 years plus reintroducing longleaf pine to the landscape, a lot of the South Georgia landscape, some up here in North Georgia as well. Lavender Mountain being one of the most notable locations, but even a little bit further north than that. The challenge with some of the young longleaf pine, as I've seen, is I don't have the numbers for Georgia, but for Florida, a lot of the stuff that we're planting, only about 20% of it's getting burned. So we really got a 20 to 21, 22% are getting burned. So we really got to step up our game on burning young longleaf, but that's a different discussion. We've known about the role of fire on these older stands, but the mechanics of how to do it has kind of challenged us a lot. But this is not a longleaf pine talk. This is a southern pine talk. So my foresters in the audience, what are our southern pines? What are the 4 southern pines that we typically manage here in Georgia? Don't be afraid. Loblolly, perfect. Slash pine. And the last, I'll give a hint. Screen. Shortleaf, yeah, right. So longleaf, shortleaf, loblolly, slash. Probably not managing a whole lot of slash pine up here, but you never know. There could have been an Auburn forester working up in this part of the world at one time. I say that as an Auburn graduate, and I know there's a few of you in the crowd, War Eagle. Yeah, so I mean, I think that's what we're really missing from the landscape. I read a really neat review paper from a colleague of mine that's going out to print, and that's, you know, what are we missing from the landscape? Is it old longleaf pine trees that are fire maintained? Well, yes, but it's old pine trees in general that are fire maintained. And I think by putting the focus on longleaf for so long, we've missed some of these other opportunities. For example, just looking at this picture alone, look at that shortleaf pine stand. I'm directionally challenged. Let's say lower right-hand corner. I mean, that's in central Alabama. That's, you know, some beautiful quail woods in central Alabama. And you're not going to get that without fire. And of course, slash pine, if you're down around the coast, you know, fire is an important component of that. But even loblolly pine, that, you know, this particular picture is just a little bit south of here, or maybe a lot south of here, Americus, you know, where this landowner was managing his mature loblolly pine with fire. Of course, the quail, the density was a little bit high on this particular stand pictured, but quail didn't know the difference on that burned habitat that is being managed. So, you know, I think that we're coming around to recognizing that a lot of these ecosystem services that we were just saying that we're finding in longleaf pine systems are in fact ones that we find in a lot of our other southern pine systems as well, if we're managing with fire and their older systems, older trees. So let's back up. I think this predates anybody in the room, I hope. But, you know, we knew that fire was an important part of the landscape, and not just in longleaf pine systems, but across the state of Georgia. You know, a lot of these forest type, a lot of these grassland types, and a lot of these really unique embedded habitats, fire was a very integral part. It was part of the cultural legacy of the South, and in many areas it still is. But we got really good at our outreach and education in the late 1930s and early 1940s on the evils of fire and the suppression of fire. And we've gotten really good at suppressing fire. Georgia was one of the original states, southern states, along with Florida and Mississippi and South Carolina, on this multi-million-dollar program, which in the 1930s was a lot of money. Well, it's a lot of money right now, but at least on a forester's salary. You know, this concept of a Southern education project, Dixie Crusaders was a term that was used. And they use this emerging technology called moving pictures. I mean, can you imagine to show private landowners that fire was bad on the landscape? Here was this silviculture tool that they've used all their lives, not as a silviculture tool, but used it in their woods, and all of a sudden they're being told it's bad because they're using this new technology called moving pictures. This is Burning Bill, and the upper left-hand corner was filmed in, I want to say it was filmed in Bainbridge, Georgia. Of course, those are slash pine, and you know, again, this was a really effective program, getting this idea that fire was bad on the landscape. And so we moved from a landscape where fire moved across frequently with low intensity. I mean, this is not a news story to anybody in the room. I'm just saying it just to kill time. That fire was frequent and low intensity to one that was less frequent and more intense when we were burning. And not that that's a bad thing. I'm not implying that that's a, you know, I'd rather see that than asphalt, than a, you know, Walmart distribution center. But it's not the same. It's a whole different suite of ecosystem services and critters and all that sort of thing. You know, the irony of the Dixie Crusaders is their first show, the first implementation of it. Sorry, and I got to stay close to the microphone. The first implementation was in Waycross, Georgia. And there's this, in their annual reports, there's a story of having to brave this hurricane force winds and rain, not too different from the conditions I used to drive up here today from Auburn, to get to Waycross, to show these moving pictures to these people in the Waycross area that fire was bad. And if you look at this picture, you know, Okefenokee Swamp area, if you look at this picture from April of 1933, you can see that that was fire maintained habitat. In fact, there's a fire scar on the tree that they're cutting down. But the irony is some of the worst wildfires that we've seen in Georgia are in those areas that we tried to suppress fire initially through the Southern Forestry Education Project. So I mean, the irony of it's kind of interesting. But anyway, you know, the outcome is the same in that we transitioned these forests from open pine, fire managed grassland, savanna, woodlands, to fire suppressed forests, mesophytic forests. So this picture is actually from Roland Harper. This is actually in Jacksonville, Alabama, but it could be Lavender Mountain. Early pictures could have been any of these ridge and valley areas. Again, fire maintained to what a lot of them look like now, where there still may be old longleaf pine trees out there holding on, or old loblolly pine trees holding on. And to put fire in those takes a very special set of circumstances. And certainly Piedmont, again, these are Alabama pictures, but it could have been anywhere in Georgia. We see these open fire maintained pine forests, and then we keep fire out, and you have the lower right-hand picture as well. And then you move along the coastal areas, and this is the Flomaton stand, and what was the Flomaton stand in South Alabama, Flomaton, Alabama. That was owned by Algier Sullivan Lumber Company. And it was called, the owner of Algier Sullivan in this black and white picture, he called it the Hell Freezes Over stand. And it was called the Hell Freezes Over stand because he said, I will never cut this stand until hell freezes over. Well, I'm happy to say that hell must have frozen over, because that stand was cut several years ago following a major hurricane, Hurricane Ivan, actually. But what we were able to glean after that is there was a period of time when it transitioned from Algier Sullivan to, I'm trying to think of the name of the timber company now, but they kept fire out, and they kept fire out for decades. And this is the same vantage point that you saw of that stand many, many decades after fire suppression. And if you look very closely in that picture, if it's not too pixelated, you could actually see a person standing in there. Covered in chicks and tigers, I'm sure. But this is really my first introduction to the challenges of reintroducing fire. We knew at the Flomaton stand that we had old longleaf pine trees. They were fire suppressed. We knew that fire was important to restoring the habitat, but we didn't really, well, we actually were young and arrogant, and we just assumed that we could apply fire at any particular time and it'd be fine, and we were wrong. So just another example, this is the aerial, open pine, woodland, whatever you want to call it on the left. And on the right, following fire suppression, closed canopy, probably mesophytic type forest. Again, not a bad thing, just a whole different suite of species and ecosystem services. Another picture of it, and again, I'm just kind of building this case of how it became known to me. That's Tom Croker in the left-hand picture, who was a researcher with the Southern Research Station at the Flomaton stand. And on the right is, I want to say this is 50 years apart, might be 40 years apart, Dr. John Cush in the right-hand picture, just to show you how that forest type changed. Again, there were elements of that original forest still there. There were still longleaf pine, old longleaf pine, 100, 200-year-old trees. But there was no fire on that landscape. And what we saw is one of the neighbors in Alabama was burning garbage on their property, because that's what we do in Alabama, is we burn garbage on our property, sometimes in a 55-gallon drum, but not always. And it jumped into this Flomaton stand, and it wasn't really an intense fire. There was some roads around it. It was like 10 acres. And it, as we use the vernacular, it skunked around. It wasn't a very intense fire. The volunteer fire department came out. It was close to supper time, and they're like, it's not really doing anything. Let's, go get a bite to eat, come back, check on it. Just kind of skunked around, and it was smoldering. And the idea was, okay, we really dodged a bullet here. This could have been a really catastrophic crown fire, had it got in there, but this one was just a very low intensity fire that was skunking around, much like these pictures. Came out the next day, and you see it's kind of burned around the trees, but there wasn't a whole lot of brown needles on the tree. We're like, okay, problem or disaster averted. But we were wrong, really wrong. And what's interesting, and again, that was 1995. Trees looked great for about 12 months. And then after about 12 months, we started seeing a lot of this. And this is where the pictures start getting a little pixelated. Flagging, as the scientists call it. The trees were dying. The beetles loved it. Southern pine beetles, black turpentine beetles, ips. I mean, it was like, you know, open buffet for them. So that little 10-acre smoldering fire, this is what it looked like about 2 years after. Just a snag farm of trees. And so, you know, what was a small trash fire ended up being a catastrophic fire. And this was with longleaf. And it really caused us to relook at, you know, what the challenges were with reintroducing fire into longleaf. And we really thought we were on to something new. Like, oh man, this is like groundbreaking sort of research. This shows you how old this presentation is, because I still use these little graphics to come in. Only longleaf pine suffered mortality in this particular one, and it was all the big trees, the big diameter trees. And it was all of our old trees that were getting killed with this low intensity smoldering fire. And we were seeing it other places as well. This is the Patterson tract at Eglin Air Force Base. It was a multi-100-acre tract of really, really old longleaf pine that had been fire suppressed. And somebody decided that that fire, again, was important in this habitat. They wanted to restore fire maintained systems. So they were going to burn on a dry day, but not too dry, but dry. And had this low intensity fire move through. And 2 years later, they had 200 acres of snag farm. The other picture is the Boyd tract up in North Carolina. Same sort of thing. Wildfire, but it was a smoldering fire, took out a lot of these trees. Yeah, I've killed a lot of trees in my career, so I could show dead tree pictures all day long. I really like red-headed woodpeckers. Anyway, some more. Again, okay, here we are. This is where I need to be. We really thought we were on to something new, so we started digging into the literature. And well, lo and behold, and this is true with a lot of research that I've done, and a lot of things that I've done, is I'm never really that creative. I never discover something new. Somebody else has always done it before me. And here was a study from 1960. I mean, on the calendar, that was a long time ago. It doesn't feel like necessarily that long ago, but it was. Cool burns and pine mortality. And this is a Southern Forest Education or Experiment Station. And they were seeing back then in the 1960s and documenting these low intensity smoldering fires effects on killing southern pine trees. And it goes back even further than that. Southern Lumbermen had an article in the 1930s on it. So, you know, we weren't really discovering anything new, but we were rediscovering a process. And I guess that's ultimately why I'm here, is that learn from my mistakes, learn from some of the others' mistakes here in the crowd, that, you know, these take a very special set of circumstances to reintroduce fire into these stands. And the last one is, what's unique is we're not seeing it just in southern pines, but we're seeing it in most of our pine forests, like out in places in Oregon and Washington State, and some of these Mesic and Xeric pine stands, ponderosa pine stands that they have there. They're seeing mortality from smoldering fires as well. So what they actually do is they rake around all their trees, and I'll talk about raking at the end of my presentation. So enough doom and gloom and history lesson. You know, why do we restore fire? Well, again, there's a whole suite of ecosystem services that I think fire maintained pine forests provide. And, you know, we could go through the list, you know, carbon, hydrology, certain species habitats that we're not going to have in fire suppressed stands. So that alone is important. But what's the last element in restoration that's really hard to replicate? Anybody know what that is? So one element that's, I haven't figured out how to replicate it. I wish I could. It's time. You can't replicate time. Still takes the same amount of time to grow old trees. So, you know, if you have old trees, 50-year-old, 100-year-old trees, and you want to maintain an old stand, then how do you figure out how you can work in those parameters? Because if you clear cut it and start over, well, you got that time element that you're going to have to deal with. So that's, to me, that's one of the biggest reasons why. It's just, you want to maintain those old trees. So how do you do it? Well, I can tell you now, after about 20 years of working in forests, doing this, I don't know. Fire works. It works pretty well under very conservative conditions, but you're still going to kill some trees. Mechanical works some places it works well, other places it doesn't work well. So I think, we're still continually researching this and trying to add to this discussion more. So I'm going to kind of skip through the science a little bit because I can see people nodding off. So, again, this picture is important though. And, our focus was at looking at the tops of the trees and crown fires, and the importance needs to be down at the ground level. And that's this organic material that's building around these trees. Whereas in a frequently burned stand, all your roots are below the soil, and the ones that aren't being burned, the roots are growing in that organic duff material. And it's those low intensity fires moving through and smoldering, killing a lot of those fine roots or girdling that tree, allegedly, that's causing some of these issues. Yeah, so that's frequent fire. There's not a whole lot of debris. Let's say you're burning on a 3-year rotation. You're not going to see a lot of organic debris around the tree. The roots are going to be below ground. But when you get into these old fire suppressed stands, it is pretty significant. Some cases you can see up to 12 inches or more of organic debris around the base of those trees. I've been in some areas up on the Talladega National Forest where you can actually sit there and bounce up and down on that organic debris. It's so thick. So how do you deal with it? Well, I'll talk about that in a second. But this was the issue. This is not my science, but really cool series of slides. And just kind of scale down to that bottom slide that at 110 minutes post ignition, under the wrong conditions, if that duff layer was too wet, it was smoldering around the base of those trees. And again, I don't know the mechanism, whether it was girdling or killing of roots. And I don't think that there's a consensus among researchers either. The end result is you had dead trees. And I think we all want to avoid dead trees unless we're starting to manage again for red-headed woodpeckers. So that was the issue, is the smoldering around these trees. And can't really see the picture on the lower right. That's what it looks like without an infrared camera. And we may have seen it after we've burned. It's just that little wisp of smoke. But in fact, there may be a lot more going on in that organic material that we need to look out for. And just another picture of it. Again, I'm not going to get into the science to spare you. We can kill longleaf pine. See, I didn't change that one. Let's take that longleaf pine out and just put southern pines. I've killed shortleaf, killed loblolly, killed slash. All those old southern pines I've killed with fire under the wrong conditions. And that's where that organic material is too dry and it allows smoldering around those trees. And it is related to that forest floor consumption with temperatures sufficient, again, whether it's girdling the tree or killing the roots. I'm seeing it across the board. It's usually a delayed mortality, and it can be a year or two. So how do we get around it? Again, burning is part of it, but you got to pick your conditions. And you have to retrain the conditions that you're looking at to try to get fire in there in a very conservative manner. And the smoke person's probably not going to like to hear a lot of this, because the conditions that I love to burn these fire suppressed stands on are not necessarily the greatest conditions for ventilation of smoke. So here's an old picture. This is typical. Again, this could be any of our southern pines. And in fact, I think there's some loblolly pine in this picture, but not entirely. That probably hadn't been burned for 40 years. So I was just using fire to try to reintroduce fire very conservatively into this stand to slowly peel off the layers of that onion so that I'm not putting too much stress on that tree. And I'm missing the other picture, but so the conditions would have been, 1 to 2 days after a rain, a soaking rain, and maybe borderline stable to unstable atmospheric conditions. So I wasn't and the RH was pretty high on the high end of the prescription, so that I wasn't scorching the trees either. Because it seems to be that certainly the girdling of the trees is an issue, but if you girdle them and you scorch them at the same time, my experience has been you can really hammer them, really kill some trees that way. And loblolly seems to be particularly sensitive to scorching in this particular situation. So retrain your mind to those sorts of conditions. Again, I'm going to repeat it. 1 to 2 days after a rain, soaking rain, and then fairly conservative conditions. You don't want to be burning the stand in 20% RH, unless you want to replant it. I would say 35 would be on the low end. I'd love to hit it at about 40. Change some of your tools as well. A moisture meter is a good tool to have. Again, I used to just say, well, put your hand in the dirt, and if it comes back and it's wet, I mean, those are good conditions to burn it. But some of the scientists, actually, it's Nathan Klaus saying, 75% moisture somewhere is that sweet spot. Obviously you don't want it to be 100%, but you don't want it to be too much lower than 75%, because then you start getting smoldering. For my cell phone, and a lot of the cell phones, they have FLIR camera attachments on them now. It's a good thing to have. You can tell some of that smoldering. And then if you see smoldering around those trees, you can do mop up around those trees, and that's important. So just some more pictures of what it looks like. This is just really labor intensive. I mean, I can't really see any other way around it. And I think the people that have done this successfully would agree with me. This is labor intensive work. But again, if you're trying to preserve a resource like a 100-year-old tree or a 100-year-old stand of trees, that's what you're going to have to put into it. I don't think a lot of the cost share programs that are out there adequately have the finances set aside for this type of burning, because it is really labor intensive. You can see in this particular case, pretty stable atmospheric conditions, not a whole lot of ventilation of the smoke, close strip head fires. I'm not backing it because I don't want a lot of residence time around the trees, and just kind of moving it through. This is what it looks like on the ground. Pay attention to those 10 and 100-hour fuels in the picture. You can see too, 2003 is when I took this picture. That was 20 years ago. So we've been at this a while, but you can see how we're not, this before and after, we're not smoldering around these trees. We're actually just skimming off a layer each time. Again, pay attention to those heavier fuels. See, they're not getting consumed in the fire. So that tells you not only the technique that we're using, we weren't backing it in, but the fuel moisture was pretty high too. I see a good number of pine needles on the ground, so it probably got a little bit hotter than it should have, but that's the challenge of reintroducing fire. Here's just another picture. And again, just skimming it in and not taking it down to the forest floor on one single burn. It may take 4 or 5 different burns to get it in. Again, just some more pictures. Again, just really low intensity first entry burns. Okay, so the big one that I always hear about is raking. As I mentioned, this is the standard tool in a lot of ponderosa pine forests out west, is raking. And I also mentioned that fine root mortality may be part of this issue in some of our southern pines. So that was always what I said, is we just don't know what raking does in these southern pine forests. So we kind of have to rely on folks that are out there doing it. And, Marty, I'd asked you one time, you'd raked around some of your trees and you just saw we weren't seeing negative effects of raking. So go out in advance of burning and rake that duff away from the trees. Again, very labor intensive. I don't know how long it took you guys to do each tree, but probably 20 minutes, probably depending on how many folks you had there. And then Nathan Klaus down on Pine Mountain was seeing the same thing, raking around some of his trees. They weren't seeing mortality as a result of raking. But I contrast that with some studies that were done at Eglin or down at Ordway in Florida, where they were seeing mortality following raking of these trees. And that's just fine root disturbance. So, I mean, I hate to sound like a researcher, but I'm going to, that we just need more research on this. We need to find, what it is. Can we rake these trees or can we not rake these trees? And if we can't, what are the circumstances? Because you're a very trustworthy person. I trust that, your information is correct. You didn't have any mortality from raking, but I also know the person that did it at Eglin. And if he says he killed a bunch of trees, he killed a bunch of trees. So why is it different? Was it the time of year? You didn't rake them in. Okay, so you didn't take it down to mineral soil. So you just kind of. So Dr. Cipollini was saying that they didn't rake down to bare mineral soil. They just did a light raking around the trees. So the Eglin study, I'm pretty sure it was to bare mineral soil. So maybe there's a sweet spot, but where is that sweet spot? I don't know. And how do you get a bunch of tree planters that you've turned into tree rakers to describe it to them, where that sweet spot is? So I don't know. We have some colleagues at Tall Timbers and at Auburn that have a study that's going in looking at this sort of thing, a replicated study on raking. And I hope that in the next few years, we can get even more data on it and help tell this story a little bit more. If you're like me, you're impatient and you're like, well, if it's going to take 10, 15 years to start seeing a visible difference in this forest, I don't have time for that. My client may not have time for that. So where does mulching fit into this? Can I go into this loblolly stand in advance and mulch it and then burn it? Again, I think you can. It's adding fuel to the fire, literally. So you just got to be very cautious about it. And then mulching alone, of course, is not going to take the place of fire. So mulching followed up by burning, but you just got to be really cautious of it. And there's a site in central Alabama where I've done this for the past 15 years. I mulched it, I burned, put some herbicide out, targeted herbicide, mulched it again, burned. And then finally, a decade and a half later, I'm to an area where I'm like, I can pretty much burn under any condition now, red flag conditions, any condition where I can get a permit. So it takes a while, it's intensive to get there, but mulching is a tool. Again, I think you got to be careful putting a bunch of fuel on the ground. Part of the challenge that I've seen is just the smoldering aspect of mulching as well. And this was really highlighted in a longleaf and slash pine stand down around coastal Florida. This was a few years ago. We mulched it because that's what the client wanted, was to go in and mulch out all those hardwood shrubs and yopon and all that stuff that had come in through fire suppression. And we did it and it looked great. It wasn't down to bare mineral soil, so we got fire in there. I was mopping this stand up for 6 days. 6 days. A lot of water. So again, very, very labor intensive to do it, but we saved the trees. Don't have this issue so much here in North Georgia. Some of these old fire suppressed stands, whether they're slash pine or longleaf, may have turpentine cat faces on them. I don't know how you deal with these. I've had good experiences and I've had bad. It's always fun to create these redwood sort of drive-through trees. You've seen those where you can drive your car through them. They're a challenge that you got to pay attention to on top of the smoldering issue with fire. So doom and gloom, but I will say that it can be done. And we have people in the audience that have done this successfully. This is not a picture of Lavender Mountain in the upper left-hand picture, although Lindsay, you and I were at Berry College in the late 1990s and took some pictures that aren't too dissimilar from that of a fire suppressed stand. And the last time I was up there, which unfortunately was probably 4 or 5 years ago, this is what it looked like today. And I think just through prudence and hard work, they've been able to restore fire to that site. And you should be congratulated for a job well done, because it's not easy. It's not easy. I've seen it in South Georgia when I came to the Jones Center in July of 1995. This was the Turkey Woods and what it looked like when I first got there. Again, very fire suppressed site, but through mulching or mowing and burning, this is what the site looked like, decades later. And they actually didn't have a whole lot of pine mortality. Again, I'm impatient, and I usually have a few more dead trees out there. But again, you got to be cautious about it. So just some parting thoughts. As I mentioned, backing fires can relate, cause smoldering fires, so be cautious with those. Strip head fires, close strip head fires will work. Grid ignition will work, but you got to be careful of scorch, because it's that cascading effects of stress on those trees that are an issue. I think wintertime is some of the best conservative conditions, although I just haven't had a whole lot of experience trying to reintroduce fire in the summer. Somebody may come to me after this and say, hey, we've had a lot of experience, and I'll listen. But what's most important is when that duff is wet. And again, doesn't matter the southern pine species. I like those somewhat stable atmospheric conditions, because I'm not getting a lot of heat up to the tops of those trees. You got to have that high relative humidity recovery if you can. And then a lot of water and mop up. And that's where that little FLIR camera comes in handy. And just make sure that you're putting out any sort of smoldering afterwards. So with that, I don't have a clock up here, so I may have gone 20 minutes over. I got 5 minutes. Wow, I have done this a few times. My point is you can reintroduce fire to these stands. Be patient, be conservative, but know that it's an issue to get fire back into these stands. And there's other tools that are out there. I'd be a little cautious on recommending raking right now. At least raking to bare mineral soil certainly seems to be the issue. Maybe a little bit of light raking can do it. And if you're mulching ahead of any sort of burning, just be cautious, because that stuff that you're putting on the ground, that mulch that you're putting on the ground, is probably going to become involved in fire at some point. You're going to have to do a lot of mop up as well. But it can be done, and it may take 10, maybe 15 years to reintroduce it. And at the end, you're still ahead because you got 80 to 100-year-old southern pine trees there. So hopefully that's insightful. If not, again, I recommend little brochures like this one out on the table. And feel free to share with me after the fact some of your experiences with this as well, because we're all learning from each other on this. So with that, any questions or?
Questions? There's one.
You mentioned the aspect of, peeling away that layers like an onion. That causing the roots to then grow lower into the soil as you're burning down into them? Or is it just a matter of you're only removing so much at a time, so it's not causing?
I'd say probably the second part of it. That's just my gut instinct. The scientists may tell me different. I think it's kind of equivalent to the light raking that you're talking about, is that you may be causing a little bit of root damage through the light raking or burning those upper layers, but it's not so much stress on the tree that it can't handle it. But if you raked it all the way to bare mineral soil, or you burned it all the way down to bare mineral soil, that seems to pass some sort of threshold where that's just too much stress. My guess.
Time for one more.
I just wanted to add something to that. One of the things that we observed is after we did the first prescribed burn and got down to that top layer, we actually accelerated the composition. So it was
Hmm.
duct layer. So
That's
that
interesting.
is a more gentle removal of the duct environment.
So did y'all hear that statement? Okay. Can I sum it up? As they were going through this process of burning and taking off small layers at a time, it seemed to accelerate the decomposition of that organic layer. More so than, and it was a little more gentle than raking itself. So does that basically sum it up? So, yeah.
All right, thank you. I think we're out of time.
Yep.
Thanks for the presentation, everyone.